Hey there, this is OneUp Indie coming with a crash course in DnD, which stands for drag and drop. And then, for example, this is then a thing which you can, for example, do in drag and drop. So basically, this will be giving you the most important things which, if you want to start your game development journey, not with programming, but with DnD, which is kind of programming, but without programming. So this is kind of a visual tool just to make programming a little bit more palpable, and that stuff is actually used in schools also as an alternative for getting into, well, game development. So if you want to know a little bit about that, or you're just curious how that stuff works in Gamemaker Studio, stick around. This is OneUp Indie. I am a developer, so if you like what you're seeing, hey, why not consider sharing, liking and subscribing. Alrighty, so this is how we could start. So basically this is just an empty room. So for example, if this is not opened, well, this is, I guess, the start room, which is then you just double click on it and then it opens up, and it basically has the background and the instances and a little bit work from my side. I just have all these sprites already assigned. So basically they are just images, so don't get confused what this stuff is. Basically just images. For example, desert just has 1 frame, or for example a shot has 2 frames, so we can kind of animate, but I'm not gonna go into that kind of detail. So for a setup, so it actually looks a little bit nicer, let's go to our background and assign it an image, a sprite. So you can, I don't know, take one of those, or I guess this is the lazy better way, you can just drag it in there, and it is here. Normally it starts off like this. As you can see, it's a little bit small, so therefore we stretch it to the whole room, so where everything is visible, and then we want to vertically give it a little bit of a speed. So basically here you have a little button, and then of course, not good because it's getting out of the screen, and therefore we need to vertically tile it. So basically we have kind of a repeating thing, and then we kind of simulate movement, which could be great for our spaceship. But this is of course then up to you how you want to do that. And then for example, I have a second background here, once again kind of same stuff, but here we stretch it, make it vertical, and just go with the vertical speed of that, and therefore boom, we got some more atmospheric stuff already as a background, which is pretty neat. Alright, so the first thing which you need to understand is DnD and GML are basically 2 systems how you can define your control in your video game. So for example, where is the control? Well, it's sitting in all the objects, because they are in the end the things which define how the game is working, where stuff is moving. It's the player, it's just giving instructions, it's shooting, it is pulling, pushing, changing the colors and all that stuff. So basically objects are the thing where all the action is happening, and to control those actions and those commands which you are giving to, well, Gamemaker and to make your game are in here. And they have 2 kind of systems. One is GML, which is Gamemaker language. This is a script language. So for example, object player, so let's go. And then for example, Gamemaker Studio is event driven, so in these events you can do stuff and setup. So let's say for example we just have that, and then on the right side this is then the DnD part, which is the drag and drop, and you don't do any programming per se. You kind of have these Lego blocks which you just put in, and then something is happening. For example, you just want to move, so jump, and then for example you just say like, hey, let's move it somewhere. So here you can have this toolbox which is on the top right, and just saying like, hey, if you know how that thing is called, so for example if you hover over, just says jump to point, and these things will repeat during your DnD, or basically in this course, because we're gonna do it at as efficient as possible and as easy as possible for you guys. So let's get rid of that. And then, well, the first thing which we want to do in this event-driven thing, first of all, let's give our player a little bit of a cool sprite. Once again, you can just assign it here, and then everything which you have there is listed, or you can just drag and drop it to where it is, and then, well, we can actually place our player, not the sprite, just the player in the room. This is how it happens. And then, well, we can do a few things. So double click on our player. And first of all, hey, let's give him a little bit of movement and control. And that is happening it could be done with a step event, but we're gonna skip a little bit on that because this is a little bit more complicated. We just instantly go to these things, which is for the keyboard, and these 3 categories just mean, hey, key down means you're constantly pressing. This is, you are pressing it a little bit, but just once. And this is, for example, you release the key after you have pressed it. So for us, it's better to constantly press something. So let's go, for example, for left, and this would be then your keyboard left key. Or let's go, for example, for the right, and then we want our player to move here and then constantly move, for example, when we are pressing the right keyboard key, to go to right. And for that we have well, first of all, we need to say like, hey, are we pressing our right key on our keyboard? Great. Then we say jump to point, and then, for example, you could find it under movement, and here you have tons of categories which are then, for example, quite important and used a lot. So, for example, common instances, this is very important. Sequences, you can forget. Mouse, keyboard, forget. Gamepad, forget. Movement, and here we got our most important stuff. And then, for example, we can do a lot of things. Collisions, this is great for overlapping. Drawing, forget it, at least for this crash course. Tiles, forget it. Audio, forget it. Loops, switch, yeah, forget it. Data structures, you completely forget it. This is for advanced users. Buffers, this is for expert users. And then files and saving, completely forget all that stuff. You don't need it. Just randomness, and that's, I guess, the most important stuff. So the first thing which we want to do is to go to a place. So we say jump, and you can double click it or just drag it in there. And then you got this nice little thing, which is just saying like, hey, if we press the right key on the keyboard, we want to move to a position, an X and Y position. But here, take into consideration that these are points on your screen, or basically on this plane field, which is your room. And then on the bottom left corner, you have a kind of 2 numbers, and they represent the X and Y position. So here, this is the 0, 0 position, more or less, because I cannot pinpoint it correctly. And then, for example, the more we go to the right, we add numbers, and the more we go to the left, we subtract numbers. And this is very important for us for movement of our ship. And then, of course, if we are starting here, this is 0. If we go up, out, or for example, if you're going upwards, we're going minus values, and if we are falling down, we go plus values. So here we could say I don't know, 10, and then add it, but it says jump to 8, but we don't want to jump to 10, because that would mean like it would instantly jump to 10 pixels plus here. This is not what we want. We want to go from our relative position additional 10. So as you can see, jump to our current X position plus 10. And this is how it works. And for example, once we check this out, this is what we wanted to achieve. So boom, we have our player, and then for example, we're pressing right now, and we are going out, and of course we cannot go back. So we do the same stuff for our left keyboard. So we just go key down, left, and then once again we can use the recently used, so put that in, but now we are going minus 10, because this is then the same speed, and then of course relative, and then once again you have the preview what this thing is actually doing. And that is kind of neat, because if you're having multiple instructions, then it just says like, hey, what is this doing, what is this doing, and then for example you see sequentially what's actually happening, because let's say you have this and all that stuff, and now you see a thing which is being worked on, because first we start with this thing, then we go to the next thing, then we go to the next thing. This is called sequential, and because this is how computers work, and then we are having one thing worked after another and after another. One little important thing also is that some events are looping, constantly updating. This is very important for us. And some things are just triggered once. For example, the destroy event or the create event, which is the setup event, just are triggered just once, because they can only be triggered once. Of course, you can break that, but let's keep it clean. Then these things are just triggered once and set up once, and then boom, never to be used again. But for example, the step event, the draw, or all these inputs are constantly like checking, like, hey, are you pressing the mouse button, the keyboard, the gamepad, or whatever? Is there something? Or for example, the collision, are you hitting something or whatever? And then therefore they have different kind of meanings to control that thing. So now we established our control of our player. Let's do something a little bit more. Let's create a shot, because this already is pretty good, but let's do it a little bit better. And therefore we have this little thing which is called create instance, and we want to create something when we are pressing a button, which could be key up. Let's go for space, because why not? Bam. And then as you can see, this is a different symbol. This just means, hey, you can only press it once, and then you need to let go of the key, then press it again to trigger this event. The other ones we can actually kill, because we don't need. And here we create another instance. The way this goes is, for example, once you have something in your room, because here we have objects, and everything which is in here, it's called instances. For example, if you have an object, then you drag it in there, or for example, you create it during while the game is being played, then it's called an instance, because these are kind of carbon copies with the same properties of the same stuff, but they're just called instances. Therefore, this terminology is there. For example, these objects you kind of never have in the room. You just have those carbon copies in there, and then they are temporary. Alrighty, so the next thing, for example, we want to create an object, which is then called object shot, because we want to do some neat little shooting, and therefore we give it a sprite. So shot, and then we want to first of all create it upon pressing our space button, and then we just say like, hey, object none. This is not true. We want to have our object shot being created, so we assign it, and then, well, we want to say like, hey, where do we want to create it? Once again, a fixed position of X and Y is not a good idea. Therefore, we once again go for relative, because we want to take the relative position of our player. So here we go. And then we are creating at this specific position under the layer of instances. This is where it goes. For example, you can only create instances on instances layers. And for example, you can have multiple ones if you like. So but let's go and trash them, because we don't need them. This would only confuse, and therefore we need something where we can place stuff on. The same, for example, for the backgrounds. You can just place backgrounds on the background layer, and on the instances layer you can just place, well, your instances. So everything has its order. So for now this is pretty cool, and then we are pretty much finished with our player, so we can just close him. And then, for example, once we started, we will encounter one thing, which is that. So for example, we can move left, right. Excellent. But okay, why is that? Well, we didn't assign our well, instances of our shots to give it a specific movement. And for example, here we didn't repeat our background horizontally, and therefore we are just moving it. So let's fix this very, very quick. So horizontal, let's see if this works. Okay, so here, this is how we adapt it. And for example, here we can just say have a create event. Create event, once again, is an event which is triggered at the very beginning. So for example, once you create a shot Or for example, once you place it into the room, instantly it just says like, hey, I'm triggered once. What kind of properties do I want to have? What is happening? What kind of color am I having? What is my size? What kind of pre-instructions do you want to give me? This is what the create event is good for. For that, we just say like, hey, let's have a specific speed. And for example, this is this little icon. This is for the animation, something different. And we just drag it in. And then you have different properties, how you want to handle that. For example, the easy peasy way is just like say, hey, vertically, let's go with minus, I don't know, 5. And then we're moving upwards. This is very important then for us. And then, for example, once we started, you will see that the thing will shoot upwards. So let's say, and we are shooting. So this is already pretty good, but of course this looks a little bit silly because these shots have a bad angle. So for our setup phase, we just say like, hey, let's change the angle. This is then here set instance rotation. You just drag it in and then give it a second instruction. Hey, let's go 90 degrees. And then once we start it, so starting is just happening like this. You just press the run button or F5 and boom, let's see how that works. As you can see, now working pretty fine. So we got already a pretty decent setup concerning well, shooting and moving player. So this is pretty good. But let's go and have a thing which is, for example, giving the game a little bit more of a fun factor, because let's face it, a player which is shooting and doing nothing is kind of boring. So we go into the next thing, which is then creating an enemy. And we just create an enemy, and hopefully you see, for example, that I have given specific names, prefixes. Prefixes are, for example, a naming order. So for example, the stuff which is then before, and then the name how it's being called. So for example, I don't know, enemy pong, because it's going left and right. We will do that. And then, for example, if there are images, then you have SPR, which is short for sprite. And therefore, you have a naming convention, because let's face it, this thing and this thing could be the same for you if you just look at it, and therefore it makes sense to give it a naming convention. Of course, you can call it O something or object fully written. This is just a description which is making easier for you to distinguish if this is just an image or if this is an object. Of course, you can I don't know, do something like this and give it well, I don't know, a background color if this is, for example, something you like. But of course, this is then up to you. So the next thing which we want to do is give our object enemy a sprite and give it a place stamp, for example. Let's place as you can see, for example, you cannot drag an object onto a background layer. So for example, if you are on the correct layer, boom, we can create multiple enemies. So let's just go for 2, so they will ping pong. And now we have a problem, because let's say we give it a speed, which is going left or right, then they could go out of the room and then they're pretty much gone. So this is not the best way to go. But let's start off and give it an start create event, which is just once again setting up what we want to do. And we can, for example, set the speed, again put it in here, then you can say horizontally, but now we are changing it a little bit, so it's kind of interesting to use this direction system also. So basically what you have at the very beginning for movement are 2 things. You have speed and you have a direction, which is then, for example, fixed. And then you can say like, hey, let's go left. And then the first direction is going to the left with a specific speed. Let's go with, I don't know, a value of 2. So basically we are moving to the left with a speed value of 2, and those things are linked to each other. And then, for example, on the preview, you see set direction to 180. This just means This is then the Gamemaker Studio system, which is starting at 0, going to the right. Up is 90 degrees, going left is what is it? Yeah, going left is to 180, and then going downwards to 70, and then 0 is once again a full circle. So for example, if you want to just see what kind of value that has, you can see it here by pressing on these buttons, but we just want to go left and right and keep it simple and clean. And for now, if you, for example, start it, they will go out of the out of the game, which is not the most optimal way. So as you can see, they're doing their thing, and then bye bye, go into infinity to the left side. This is of course thing which we don't want to have, and therefore we want to create some walls which we later on will set to invisible. And then, for example, if the enemy is touching, or this is the technical term is colliding with the walls, then boom, let's change the direction in the opposite thing. So for example, we just had object wall, give it a sprite, and then place it into the room. So for example, here we just place it into the room, then copy paste that, place one here, and then once we have a collision, we say like, oh, the direction is not good for us, we want to change it to the opposite. So how can we do that? Kind of easy. We just go into our enemy pong, and then we have a little thing which is then checking all the time for collision, and then it says like, hey, collision with whom? So with our object wall, boom, and then we have kind of an easy thing which is then reverse. Then we just put it in, and then it's just saying like, hey, reverse your direction. And this is basically it. So let's check this out. Alrighty, and now you see this is working beautifully, and now we have kind of enemies which are blocking, well, later on blocking, for example, our shots or whatever. So this collision is a very crucial thing, which is then giving the game boundaries and some rules, and therefore this is very, very important. So the next thing, for example, what we can do is say like, okay, our object shot having a collision with, for example, an enemy. What do we want to have? Well, we want to destroy it so the enemies can actually block. This you can do from two sides. You can, for example, set it up from the perspective of the shot or from the perspective of the enemy. This is then up to you how you want to handle. And then, well, we have, for example, the shot is moving upwards and then colliding with an enemy. So what's happening? Well, we want to destroy it. So destroy. Then we have destroy instance, which is good. And then we destroy ourselves. Here you see a little triangle. For example, if you press on that, you can change the target. So for example, if you say, for example, hey, my shot actually wants to destroy the other thing which it is colliding, for example, an enemy or an asteroid, then you can set it to other, but the default one is self. So let's check this out. So now we are shooting, and as you can see, our shots are going upwards, but once they are touching the enemy, then they are being destroyed because you have a collision, so an overlapping of the shots with the player. So the next thing which we want to do is, because the walls are kind of ugly, they are just for us, so they kind of work, so we just set them to invisible. Boom. As you can see, they are still there, but once we run the game later, they are invisible because we don't need to see them, because this is just a thing which is important for the programmers, for the game makers, but not for the players which want to enjoy the game. So the next thing which we want to do is, to make it a little bit more fancy, let's add an explosion. So object explosion, here we go. Set it to a neat looking sprite, so here I have one. So once again, all the sprites, so basically all the images, link in the description below where you can get them and you can assign them, and this is like pew pew pew, doing some pretty cool stuff. So this is pretty good for us. Then, so therefore we have our explosion, and we want to use it once, for example, our shot is touching something. So we go and once again see, okay, we are being destroyed, but then we want to create an instance. So instance, or let's go with create. Here we go. Create instance, boom. So we destroy ourselves, and the next thing which we are following on the same position. So therefore we just go once again, not with hard values in the room, but with relative values. And then we create something which is, for example, our explosion instance. And now what is happening is a little bit wonky. If you, for example, see that now, so for example, we are just shooting and boom, our explosion is not going away. It is animating, but explosions are a one-time thing. You explode and then this is it. And therefore we need to adapt a little bit with an event, which is very, very useful. So basically you just go into our explosion object, go under other, and then you have animation, and this just goes and says like, hey, what's actually happening once we are hitting our last frame of our animation. And then we just, well, destroy ourselves, and then we remedy how the whole thing works. So here once again, pretty neat and easy system. So the next thing which we want to do is, because hey, this could be a little bit boring, let's give it some randomness, let's give it a spawning, so we actually have something to do, because just shooting an indestructible enemies is kind of okayish, but it's maybe a little bit boring. And therefore we will create a rock which will fall down from the sky, so therefore on asteroid. So object, I just call it a rock here because then it's a little bit faster to type, and then we give it a nice little sprite, our asteroid. And then one thing which is kind of important, so let's say for example we have our asteroid and we place it here, and we want it to fall down first of all, and we want to rotate it, but with the rotation comes a little bit of an issue. So let's say you want to rotate all the time. So for example, if you just trigger it once, here we come to an issue because you rotate it once and then, well, this is it. So therefore you need a way to update your rotation each step, which is 60 times per second. So 60 times per second, do something. For that we have the step event. You have 3 ones. You're totally fine with the first one. The other ones are just for advanced users, but of course you can use them if you like. Doesn't really matter to us. And then we say like, hey, angle, as you can see, set instance rotation, boom, and then we have an angle of 0, so once again pointing to the right. And then we just say like, okay, let's rotate it. So let's go, I don't know, let's go with 15, 10, let's go with 15. But here once again, not a good idea, because this would just instantly stick it to 15 and then there would be no rotation. Therefore we just go boom, relative. Once again, add 15 to the internal rotation of this rock. So for example, once we start it, and now this is looking a little bit jiggleish. So what is actually happening here? Because this doesn't feel and look right, and of course it's a little bit fast. So let's go to our asteroid, and normally if you import sprites, so images, then they are centered at the top left corner, which is totally fine. So this is called the anchor point, but then you have a rotation along this anchoring point. So therefore we just drag it into the middle, or we just say middle center, boom. And then for example, once we start it again, as you can see now, the rotation is correctly more in the middle and therefore looking much better. Of course the speed is quite high, so let's reduce this. So let's go into our rock, let's go with a added rotation of 5 in the step event, so it's updating 5 all the time. And now let's make it fall. For that we can just go once again in the create event, so setting up kind of our speed downwards. So once again you can just say speed, here we go, and then use it in combination with direction, or you can just go vertical, so basically going downwards, and then add, I don't know, 5 going downwards. And then for example we could do, this is terrible way to do it by the way, just have a different kind of asteroids, and then I don't know, let's mark them all and then copy paste them. Then for example, to select multiple ones, you need to hold the key above the control key, and then you can mark multiple instances in the room. And then for example, this is how you could do the game, but of course this is not the best practice, so let's check this out because it does actually work. So you will see that we have falling things, and of course now they are doing nothing because, well, we have not set up any collision, and then the game would be over. So this is kind of boring. So first of all, let's remedy a few things. So first of all, our shot has a second collision with our rock. And then what do we want to do? First of all, we want to destroy, because destroying is always good. So boom, we destroy ourselves. So once we're hitting a rock, then the shot is gone. Then we destroy the other thing. So as you can see here, your target is now the other. And of course you have different, you can have specific targets if you like, or all or whatever, but let's go for the other. And then let's create, well, an explosion on the same spot, because hey, let's have some cool effects, and of course on the relative things. So let's start it again. So this is just for having a little bit of more of a, well, good game. So let's see. Nice. So once again, this is pretty good, and as you can see, things which are rotating or should be centered in the middle are centered in the middle. So for example, for the explosion, once again, it is in the middle spot also, so it is well, not being wonky. So once again, this system is okay, but not too much, and therefore we need to do a little bit of advanced stuff, but not really. For that, we will have another controller in the room, which is another object. So object, and then it is called spawner, because it will spawn, well, rocks. And we could do that in the step event, which would be a little bit overkill, because imagine you are spawning 60 rocks or asteroids every second. This is a little bit way too much, and therefore we can kind of use and abuse the system of the alarms, which are then, for example, very handy just to have an alarm being triggered, then an event happens and then re-trigger the alarm, but do that, for example, every 40 steps or every second, so every 60 steps. So this is then up to you. So for that, first of all, we need a create event where we say like, hey, trigger our alarm. So set it up once. So here, set alarm countdown. So basically this is the same thing which you're having if you want to do your X. And then after a minute or two, for X, I guess it's 3 minutes and upwards, then the egg is boiled. And basically this is the same stuff. This is an alarm, and then you give it a time at which point it is triggered, and then it has its own event which is having a number. So here alarm 0 is then this one being triggered, and then we want to do something. So instance create, and then we want to create once again a lovely rock on our relative position where we are. So here our spawner, drag it into the room. It's a little bit small, so a little bit bigger, and then at this spot we are spawning a thing for. So let's actually see if this does work. No, because we are triggering once our alarm, and then this is pretty much let's go with 40, 50, let's go with 50, and then we need to re-trigger the alarm. So we just go, hey, after we created our rock, our asteroid, let's re-trigger our alarm 50, and then we kind of loop, but not that often. So let's check this out. So as you can see, now this is pretty good, but of course this is just on one spot. And here we come into the territory why we do need variables. So what are variables? Variables are basically informations stored with a name with a value inside of them. So what is that? So for example, if you just go under var, so variables, there are different kind of ones. So some which are constantly there. And the meaning of a variable is basically just that you have a value which you can use all the time. You have to just to imagine a variable could be, I don't know, your points, your life, time passed, or for example some words, how your game is called or whatever. So therefore you are storing an information constantly, or for example temporarily for just one event, and after the event is gone the variable is gone. So basically you are reserving some memory in space, and then in your VRAM, and then you're letting it go because you don't need it. Or for example you have it constantly because you want to reuse it, because let's say you have lives which are for example 8, and then you reduce it by 1 and 1 and 1, and then for example after you reach 0 the game is over. Therefore it makes sense to have them constantly being there and checked, or for example just to be used once. For that we have our variable, which is temporary. Then you can give it a name. We just stick it to the same stuff, and then you need to give it a value, which could be for example in those quotations, so a word like this, or a number, which could be I don't know, something like this or something like this. It doesn't really matter. It could be a full number or whatever. So here let's go with 0. Bigger. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Here we go. But for now, this is not doing anything. First of all, we need to say like, hey, we want to create on this specific temporal variable. So this is the name, and we can actually, instead of a number, give kind of a placeholder, which is our variable, and put it in here. And this just means, hey, on this X position, spawn the rock, which has a value of 0. But of course, this is still very useless for us, but still you can substitute values with variables which hold values. So basically you just jump to this spot. So once again, variables are very important because they just say like, hey, spawn our rock at this variable, and the variable contains a value. So basically you don't input a hard value here, you have a variable which is just doing the same stuff, but of course then you can use it and do more. And what do I mean by more? Well, we can have random values. So rand, then we just can get a random number. We can just drag it in here, but it makes sense to sequentially first of all have our variable, then give it a value what you want to have. And for context, to understand, we want to have a value between, let's say, 0 to, what is this, 1360. So basically let's go somewhere between here, so 1200, and then here let's go 150, something like this. So let's go with a value between 150 and 1200, and then what is the target which we want to set? The target is our temp variable. Boom. And now what is happening? First of all, we declare and store in the memory a variable which is called temp with a value of 0. Then a random number is being generated and overwriting the value which is here with a value which is going in between those. And then we are using the same variable which has a different value now as a X position. So we're just getting a random number in here. So this is pretty good. And of course, let's put this a little bit upwards. Of course, this is still invisible, so you don't really see the instance there. But let's go with a relative value which is starting somewhere here, and then we're just spawning all the time rocks. So let's check this out. And as you can see, a rock here, a rock there, a rock there. Nice. A little bit very, very right as it seems. Kind of interesting. Oh well, so as you can see now we have achieved randomness, instance creation, instance destruction, and we pretty much did this with DnD, which is the drag and drop system, which is basically programming without actual programming. So we are pretty much finished in this, well, crash course here. Hopefully you enjoyed this. There are more things which you can do, but I guess for beginners this could be a great introduction. And then, for example, you can start playing around with all the other things which are important. For example, here for a little bit more experience, then you have if statements, which is very important. So if something is happening, do this or not, and then you can do some stuff. So that is very useful for conditions. So let's say you're having no lives left, then it's just like say like, hey, if our lives are below 0, then restart the game. Or for example, we are colliding with a thing, then let's jump to the next room. Or for example, if we are having a different condition, so let's say all the enemies are gone, hey, let's jump to the next room. And then you destroy, you spawn some neat little particles, you change how things are behaving, rotating, moving, and you can draw stuff on the screen if you like. You can play some sounds. For example, once an enemy is being destroyed, you got like pew 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 stuff. Or if you're a little bit advanced, you start with data structures, which are like variables, but a little bit more advanced, because then you hold more information. So you just spawn some stuff on the screen, or you just save, and so on and so on. Alrighty, that was it from my side. Hopefully the crash course will give you some insights to it. As a disclaimer, I am not the biggest fan of the DnD. I see it as a useful tool to go into programming, but once again, if you have bigger projects, managing that with a drag and drop would be at some point really a hassle. For example, I'm having like scripts which are, what was that, 12,000 lines. So basically doing that with drag and drop would kill me and would take me like 20 years to do instead of just a few copy pasted things. So once again, this is then coming with complexity. The more complexity you have, then the more GML is a better choice. But for example, for small games, for simple games, for prototypes, then DnD is a pretty good system overall. Alrighty, that was it from my side. Have a good one. One up, indie.